Le prochain conférencier est...
The next presenter will be Mathieu Varin from the CERFO here in Sainte-Foy. Mathieu has a master's degree from Sherbrooke University in geomatics, and he will speak to us about his work and mainly in hydrology.
And species too? Yeah, species. Okay, good morning. Thank you, Martin, for inviting me. It's very much appreciated, and it gave me an occasion to put a suit on and look clean for today. That will also allow me to speak about the CCTTs. Those are very poorly known organizations by most everybody, and as well as by the researchers. And I think it's worth it to take a few slides to define briefly what's a CCTT. So let me, I'm the representative of the CCTTs here. There are two, the CERFO and the CGQ. First of all, I have a training in geomatics. I'm accompanied by one of our forest engineers, Philippe Bournival.
The CGQ is not here today, but it's one of the two. CCTT has 45 in Quebec, and they collaborated with them, and we'll talk about that a little later. The CCTTs, they're part of a network, a Transdeck network, that regroups 45 centers of technological transfer. These centers are independently affiliated to a CEGEP, a college. And what's specific about this is that we do applied research. So we do applied research, but technical research. So I want to underline this. This is a very important point, is that the CCTTs do applied research, and they do projects with private partners, and they accompany partners to use methods. So to start with the CGQ, it's the society affiliated to Chicoutimi College, and it's mainly it has expertise in geomatics in general, acquisition of data to processing data and sharing data. For several years, they've developed an expertise, very interesting expertise on acquisition of information. They have many sensors for LiDAR captation, and they have drones. And the applications are very varied. But what's important here is the forestry applications that can be taken away from this. The CGQ is going to collaborate with our center. So the CERFO.
So the CERFO is the Forestry Teaching and Education Center based in Sainte-Foy and linked to it the Sainte-Foy College. Its expertise is in forestry. You know that there are several fields of research in forestry, mostly in remote sensing. For a few years now, we received a subsidy to develop a remote sensing lab, which made it possible for us to develop several remote sensing projects, optical sensors, LiDAR, etc. Also, one thing that's very interesting is that we have the possibility of doing satellite image acquisition for research projects. And we also took part in the campaign in the Outaouais, the LiDAR data acquisition campaign by the department, and particularly for a specific sector of a 350 square kilometer, quite sizable, although a bit small. We asked specifically to have 8 points per square meter. With those 8 shots per square meter, we'll do some research and see the difference between the two different approaches. Just to show you 3D cut with 2.5 points per square meter, I'd like to draw your attention here to what seems to be a pine, a softwood tree. With 2 points, we're not too sure, but when we have 8 points, we have a lot more information, very interesting information about structure. The main research lines of CERFO in remote sensing are quite varied. It goes from urban forestry to more standard forest environments. And the two main research projects that I'll talk about today, I'll show an example in two different lines, is the dynamics of wetlands. So the hydrological aspect with LiDAR, and then another project is the automated identification of forest species using an optical sensor, and also using LiDAR data as complementary information. So automated species identification. The first project is about pre-detection of wetlands using LiDAR. We really limited ourselves to depression wetlands. We didn't touch the intensity. We just based ourselves only on the digital terrain model, the DTM. The objectives were to develop several derived products, LiDAR-derived products. We ourselves produced those applications, and it made it possible for us to characterize some wetlands, and also to develop a method that will allow us to extract the depression wetlands semi-automatically over a large territory. So the method is to identify those depressions on the ground based on the DTM and based on the hydrological analyses. Here is just to show you the type of information we want to extract. We see a depression on the LiDAR profile, and that's what we want to extract to discover our depression wetlands. So here, that's an example on a small territory, the shaded DTM, where we see several small depressions on the ground. So what we can do with that, of course, is to characterize them, characterize that environment. We see immediately that with the canopy height digital model, we see some places where there is little tree vegetation. There's mostly low-lying vegetation. So that gives us a clue. Also, we can calculate humidity, topographic humidity index. It was mentioned earlier briefly. Those two criteria will allow us to extract our depressions. Here we have a good example of depressions that were extracted based on the digital terrain model. Several criteria were used in these models and that modeling. So as for the future of that project, what next steps, we'll do a field campaign this summer to validate our results, if there are actually depressions, if they actually appear on the ground, what are the limitations based on what we can see in the field. There are several criteria that we will be able to validate in the field to try to find thresholds for those things. There's a time analysis of satellite images. We have Pleiades satellite images. We have two from the summer of 2015, one in the spring and one in the summer. And those satellite images will help us understand the water dynamics because it moves a lot. There's another project with UCAM and UCO about the environmental DNA. That is quite interesting. They will take samples of ponds and the small wetlands, and with those water samples, they'll be able to reconstitute all the species that live or have lived in those ponds. So that's extremely interesting. For what will come after that, hydrological modeling, we'll have to rework. There are some problems with larger wetlands, especially in shallow waters, slightly bigger wetlands where there's really the presence of water, but as we know, it's always a bit difficult to get LiDAR information in those cases, and criteria adjustments. I spoke about that earlier. The second line of research about the species characterization is a project based on hyperspectral images and LiDAR data. That's a great example of partnership between CGQ, CERFO, and also the University of Sherbrooke with Richard Fournier. The objective is to have a semi-automated identification of species on a small site in the Temiskaming area. And also we want to develop a method to define the boundaries of tree groups of the same species on the ground. The CGQ was responsible for putting in place the image acquisition system. They built a system with 3 sensors, a hyperspectral sensor, the Pika-2, which is to the right here. You see the spectrum, which varies from 200 to about 1,000 nanometers, and in that we have 80 spectral strips, spectral bands, which is quite interesting. And what we want to see is whether with those 80 narrower bands, if there is any additional information we can get that can't be found with the standard cameras used for aerial photographs, where there's often 3 rather wide bands, red, green, blue, sometimes the very broad, close infrared, some 10 nanometers or 50 or 100 nanometers. But here we'll have very narrow bands down to even 6 nanometers in width. Flight was made over a site in Temiskaming. To the right, you see the hyperspectral mosaic, the flight lines. What we got, the yellow dots here are the samples that we collected on the ground. We managed to find 7 specific species, 3 in deciduous trees, red oak, yellow birch, and sugar maple, and 4 in softwood, white pine, red pine, cedar, and hemlock. And based on those samples, we analyzed the spectrum of the hyperspectral images, and that allowed us to see if there were any difference between the species. What we noted that is quite striking is that there are actual differences, and it's almost obvious. It's based on those spectral signatures. We'll be able to find spectral clues from the 80 bands. Maybe we can reduce that number of bands, and based on all that information, we'll be able to dissociate and separate and distinguish each species. It's just an example where we see 4 different species. I'll accelerate it a little bit. Close view, a zoom of the hyperspectral image where we can see on that scale, we can even see the tops, the tree tops. We can almost count them individually. And the first step in the approach that we used is to fragment that image, to have polygons which represent each of those trees. And then the next task would be to assign a species class to each of those polygons. The project is not over yet, of course, but what I can show you now is the segmentation was made. It works well. We're satisfied. We have segments and polygons almost with a single tree, covering a single tree only, and based on combining hyperspectral and LiDAR information, we use indicators such as orientation, slope, and with all that information, we already have targeted what we're going to use to dissociate and separate each species. And what's important to mention here is that we give preference to an approach by dichotomic keys. So we start from the top by separating the softwood from the deciduous trees, and then in each group of species, we again split and identify the 7 species that I mentioned earlier. Continuations of that project, well, there's an application that has been found to add 1 thermal sensor into the system to see if there's a different thermal response based on the species, and make a parallel between hyperspectral images and satellite images to see if there would not be some information that could be recovered that would make the product a lot more operational. and we could repeat and reproduce that process almost everywhere. And using the LiDAR, integrated the LiDAR based on the structure. One brief slide here to mention that various sources of funding have been used, different from academic research, but complementary. By putting all this together, I think it's a winning solution. It allows us to improve on the projects that we can do, and it's a winning solution for everyone. Those are both federal and provincial subsidies. We can also welcome students, university students. One last slide just to show you the CEGEP spin-offs. We're linked with the CEGEP. We do the research for this college, and there are spin-offs and impact directly on the training. What we develop as new knowledge is shown to students. It's used directly in the students' education. That's extremely interesting because the future forest technicians, for example, who will graduate from college in a year or two at the Sainte-Foy CEGEP. They will know what LiDAR is. They will be able to study LiDAR products. So I think it's a plus. It's a great achievement to be able to see and show what is the conclusion of those research groups. Thank you.